In 1940, the USSR annexed Lithuania. Many Lithuanians fled abroad and others went into hiding, waiting to strike. And that happened in June 1941, because then the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and thus Lithuania, and 25,000 armed Lithuanians launched an insurrection against the Soviets. This here is the story about the overlooked and forgotten June Uprising. Keep watching. During the Lithuanian Wars of Independence that occurred after World War I was over, the Lithuanians fought many enemies: the Russian Reds, the Russian Whites, the Poles, among others. At the end, they managed to secure their independence, but their cherished capital city, the city of Vilnius, ended up under the name of Vilno in the Second Polish Republic. The Lithuanians did seize control over Klaipėda, also known as Memeland in German, that came under the administration of the League of Nations after the First World War was over. One of Lithuania's most serious problems was the unsuccessful integration of this region, since the Germans living there adhered more to Germany. Two German Nazi organizations were formed that ran a propaganda line against the Lithuanian government. At the start of the 1930s, certain leaders and members of pro-Nazi organizations in the region were put on trial by Lithuania for crimes of terrorism. The 1934-35 trial of Neumann and Sass in Kaunas can be presented as the first anti-Nazi trial in Europe. 3 members of the organizations were sentenced to death and others were imprisoned. Nazi Germany exerted huge political and economic pressure on its small neighbor Lithuania over this trial. Therefore, President Smetona quickly commuted the death sentences to life imprisonment. But in 1937, those who had been sentenced were amnestied. After World War I, Lithuania had started as a Western-style democracy, but in 1926, Antanas Smetona established a military dictatorship relying upon the League of Nations system and the Western powers as guarantors of their freedom. Preserving their independent status became a bigger challenge when the Soviets and the Germans signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact in 1939. The Lithuanians could now only speculate what was to come, but what was to come had already been decided in a secret protocol in which Nazi Germany and the USSR had divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Read occupation. Hitler had already seized Klaipėda, Memeland, in March 1939. World War II started in September when Germany invaded Poland. And 3 weeks later, the Soviets marched in from the east and the country was carved up. On the 10th of October, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs Vyacheslav Molotov made Lithuania to sign a treaty with the USSR to allow Soviet troops on its soil. In return, they got Vilnius. That's right, their long-cherished capital city was now theirs, despite the fact the city had a bigger Jewish and Polish population. This sweetened the deal. Full Soviet occupation occurred in June 1940 under the pretext of Lithuanian soldiers kidnapping several Soviet soldiers. The Lithuanian army was disbanded and its leaders were exiled or executed. A People's Army was created, which was later absorbed into the Soviet 29th Rifle Corps. Many Lithuanians fled abroad to Germany, where they founded the Lithuanian Activist Front, or the LAF, led by Colonel Kazys Škirpa. Others went into hiding, waiting to strike. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of June 1941, 17,000 Lithuanians were arrested and deported. Many of them would never return. Lithuania's political, military, and economic elite were exiled. Many ministers, hundreds of teachers, 79 priests, and leaders of ethnic minorities. Most of the exiles were Lithuanians, while Jews constituted 13%, 2,045, and Poles 10%, 1,576. There were 5,060 children aged under 16 among the exiles. This had a profound impact on the Lithuanians, and it deepened anti-Soviet sentiments. And then on the 22nd of June 1941, a week after the mass deportations had taken place, Nazi Germany started Operation Barbarossa, the full-scale invasion of the USSR. Army Group North aimed its assault through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. Among its ranks were Baltic Germans who only recently had left their home country for Germany and were now assisting the branches of the German army since they knew the language, the people and the terrain. And as the Germans marched in, the Lithuanian June Uprising began as 25,000 Lithuanians armed themselves and attacked Soviet bases before the Germans could do so. Before the uprising, the LAF leadership located in Berlin had contact with the Lithuanian underground. The LAF addressed their underground comrades with "Dear enslaved brothers" and proclaimed the impending hour of liberation of Lithuania. I read the start of the uprising coincided with the German invasion. Its center was Kaunas. On the evening on the 22nd of June, the radio station was taken over. Broadcasts were then prepared, and on the next morning, LAF representative Leonas Prapuolenis read the declaration of the re-establishment of the Lithuanian independence and announced a list of members of the government. The spontaneous formed headquarters for local defense then got to work. It formed its agencies and appointed officials. Since the armed insurgents had no permanent HQ nor proper communication channels, it was hard to keep command centralized. In Kaunas there were 26 rebel units active. Their tasks were similar though. According to Kazis Ambrozaitis, a participant of the uprising and a former member of LAF, his unit first of all had to protect shops and other property from looting, to rescue from attacks by soldiers, to prevent bridges from being exploded and try to free their prisoners. However, the organization weapons was in the first place. His unit was ordered to capture a local Soviet HQ. When they arrived at the place, it turned out that the Soviet authorities had already abandoned the building. They barricaded themselves in the premise, and the building became the HQ of the old town of Kaunas. The members of the headquarters had a lot of idealism and goodwill, but lacked experience, organizational skills, and weapons. A fierce fight took place in the Kaunas suburb of Sankai. Factory workers armed themselves and fired at the retreating units of the Red Army. Many people joined the groups spontaneously, as they felt that the hour of liberation was at hand. The scale of the uprising in Vilnius was quite smaller. Here the insurgents started on the evening on the 23rd of June. They first took over the post office. Next day the guards took over the radio station and later hoisted the national flag on the Gediminas castle. Lithuanians serving in the Red Army deserted and joined the insurgency. All over Lithuania, men joined the rebels to expel the Soviets. Now, although there was a lot of fighting, the uprising occurred while the Soviets were in retreat because of the German advance. So most battles were actually pitched battles as the Red Army was making its way out. Most insurgents found buildings that were occupied by the Soviet authorities empty, and there were no weapons, and most weapons were basically acquired by individually disarming Red Army soldiers. The tactics of the rebels were different. They depended on the local conditions. However, they had some common features. Spontaneity was characteristic for the battles and the organization of the groups. The resistance lacked organization, joint leadership, along with discipline, and that determined manifestations of lawlessness, the creation of lists of unreliable persons. Another feature and problem was the shortage of weapons. Most of the rebels were young men between the age of 24 and 35. There was a rejoicing when the Germans appeared. They were greeted by the local Lithuanians as liberators. The Lithuanians had manpower of up to 10,000 to 20,000, with around 600 killed in fights with the retreating Red Army. Hundreds of Lithuanian political prisoners were massacred by the NKVD when they were retreating. This also happened in other border regions when the German offensive started. I read that the Red Army lost 5,000 men during the uprising, but I was not able to find the exact numbers of killed in action, wounded in action, POW'd or missing in action, and I was not really sure whether this was only regarding the fight against the Lithuanian resistance fighters or also in the fights against the Germans that were advancing through the country. However, the Germans were greeted as liberators. Soon it turned out they were not. The provisional government of Lithuania was soon disbanded on German orders, so were Lithuanian anti-Soviet partisan units that were largely disbanded and disarmed, and the LAF was banned at the end of September. The Germans had no interest in giving any of the Baltic nations a form of independence whatsoever, as Lithuania was incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland as Generalbezirk Litauen, and so Lithuania changed from one occupier to the other. Some Lithuanians were very willing to join the Germans and collaborated with them. Eventually the Germans were expelled and the old occupier came back. Resistance fighters that were known as the Force Brothers would resist Soviet rule for years to come. In March 1990, Lithuania was the first of the 15 Soviet republics to declare independence from the USSR. Lithuanian collaboration with the Nazis, I covered that in another video. You can find it right here. I want to thank you for watching. See you later.